Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to class here with Mr. Sheeline. If you're watching this, you are clearly here to watch the Unit 1 notes over the scientific method and variables. So let's get right into the notes and let's take a look at what I have for you guys for these notes. All right. So here are your student learning objectives for this particular set of notes and for this particular set of units, or for this unit. You can identify and understand the term science, differentiate and name different studies of science, list most of the steps of the scientific method. You can determine, define, manipulated, and responding variables, and can understand the basic construction of an experiment. So remember as well, you're going to have a quiz on Friday for A days. You'll have the quiz, or at least the quiz will be due on the following Monday if you are a B day student. So these are what I expect you guys to know and what to expect on the quiz. So, so exactly what is science? So take a second here. In your own words, quickly type or write down what you think the definition of science is without looking it up, without reading it. What is science? Okay, so take a second there to do that. Okay, so pause the video, take a second, and we'll come back. Okay. All right, so you've got the definition of science in your own words ready to go. Let's see how it matches up with mine. So what is science? So science, generally speaking, is a system of knowledge and the methods you use to find that knowledge. Okay. So it begins with curiosity, it ends with discovery is maybe another way of looking at it. Okay. So we use certain tools, we use a particular set of methods in order to solve problems, to solve issues, to find answers, or at least find answers good enough to use now that we can apply for later. Okay. So how does science find answers or at least calculate them? So think about that. It's a really good question. How does science find answers or at least calculate them? What do we do? Some don't always think about, well, how we do that is we rely on observations. So the only way you can find answers is by asking a question. And to ask a question, you have to use your senses. You have to observe and say, well, here's this thing. Why does this thing do this? Why does this thing act in this way? Well, we observe that, and then we can ask those questions, and then maybe we can then lead on to find those answers. Okay. So you have to ask, what's an observation? So more or less, observations are using or the use of senses to record or calculate a phenomenon. Okay, so you see something happening, you're like, hey, that's kind of weird. You write it down. Okay, or this smells interesting, so you smell it, you write it down. It's like, wow, that took really quick to do. Time it, you write it down. Okay, kind of seeing a pattern here. You're seeing, you're using your senses, you're recording data. Those are observations. Okay. Now, observations can be descriptive. When it comes to observations, you have your qualitative observations. So see how it's got the word quality in it. So it's what is it? So it's like, what color is it? How big is it? How tall is it? It's the quality of the thing you're describing. Okay. What does it smell like? Does it taste like anything? These are all qualitative observations. Okay. And then observations can be numerical. So these would be quantitative observations. So notice the word quantity. So how many are there? Do you have one thing? Do you have 100 things? Do you have 10 things? Okay. What is the quantity? Okay. Now that we understand or at least have a decent idea of what science is or have the definition of it, we know that we use observations to start asking those questions, and that science leads or curiosity leads to discovery, and discovery leads to more curiosity. How do we solve a challenge at home? So think about that. You got to ask yourself, how do I solve a challenge at home? So take a second here, pause the video, think of it. Really, really, truly think of it. What do we do at home to solve a challenge? So pause the video, think about it. Okay, so you pause the video, we're coming back. We've got this answer. You've really thought about how it is that you've solved a challenge at home. Well, let's see if it's really anything that scientists do to solve any issues. Okay. So technology. So technology is the use of knowledge to solve practical challenges. Okay. It's the physical things that you use, whether it's a pencil, a pen, a laptop, iPad, chairs, tables. Those are all forms of technology that you use to solve practical challenges. Okay. And it's a core idea, it's a core tool used in science to better ourselves and to answer any issues or challenges that we have. Okay. Now notice those examples I used. Okay. The first one was a pencil or a pen. Okay. Those are some of the oldest, arguably speaking, some of the oldest ways that we have jotted out observations and some of the oldest technology on the planet. Okay. So they're not just electronic devices technology. I know that we like to talk about tech as if it's only limited to electronic devices like phones and iPads and tablets and computers, and it's not. It's anything usable to further science, okay, and to solve practical challenges. So let's ask ourselves, okay, so we know we use technology. Curiosity leads to discovery. Discovery leads to curiosity. What is the goal of science? Like, what are we trying to do? Well, firstly, we're trying to expand the knowledge, right? We're trying to use that technology, which is the use of it, to then expand it. Okay, so then what do we use technology for? Well, technology, its goal is to apply it. Okay, so we can see that this thing goes this quick. I need something to time it. I'm going to develop a tool in order to time it. Okay, I make a timer. Well, what do we do now? We use it. We use that timer to see how fast something can travel. We use it to see how long it takes for something to happen. We apply that knowledge, and we can then further our measurements and our observations on that thing. Okay. So understand though that science, advances in science and advances in technology, they're cyclical. Okay, they work together. They bounce off one another. So when you have an advance in science, typically you have an advance in technology, and once there's an advance in technology, there's an advance in science, and it just keeps going in that circle. Okay. So that's pretty much what science is, a decent kind of idea of what science is. So what kinds of sciences do we study out there? Well, before we get into that, just a really quick tip. If you did not know this, a lot of words in science are related to or use rules from the Greek and Latin languages. So if you know the prefixes or the suffixes of a lot of these words, you can pretty much know what it is. Okay. So as a first one, if you see a word that has ology at the end of it, most of the time that ology is going to mean that somebody is studying something, or there's a study of some kind of thing. Okay. So then when it comes to prefixes, if you see like bio, well, bio means life. Okay. Well, geo means earth. Astro means a star or a celestial body, something floating out in space that we can see from the Earth. Okay, so if we put those all together, I think you've already pictured what I'm going to be getting into. Okay, so biology, okay, bio meaning life, ology meaning the study of, is the study of life. Geology is the study of the origin, history, structure of the Earth. Astronomy is the study of the universe, stars, and celestial bodies. Chemistry, though it doesn't really have that prefix or suffix, you at least can see, well, chemical is in the word. So chemistry, the study of the composition, structure, properties, and reaction of matter. Okay. And then physics, the study of matter and energy. Okay. So all of these are branches of science. They all are intertwined with one another. They all work together. Sometimes they can oppose one another, but most of the time they work together. And a lot of times there are sciences that are dabbling in more than just one area of science, more than one branch of science. Okay, they study life. Well, they may study life in biology, but they also might apply that to geology more or less be studying archaeology. Okay, more or less. So if you could not picture it like this: branches of science in the different types of sciences are like they're on like a science tree. Okay, so you have this science tree here. Think of it in this way: the trunk is the main center, the main focus. Science is the big thing. We use those methods. It's a way that we can advance technology. It's where we use technology. Well, they branch out to different forms. Okay, so you could branch out to geology, you can branch out to biology, you can branch to physics, chemistry, and astronomy. Okay, so they all branch out to one another, but they all use, for the most part, the same types of structures. They use the same kinds of methods in order to solve those problems, those questions that they had at the beginning. So how do they answer those questions? Well, they typically use this thing called a scientific method, which you've most likely heard of. So the scientific method is an organized plan for gathering, organizing, communicating information, okay? And we use this to answer questions as objectively and precisely as we possibly can, okay? Emphasis on objectively and precisely. Things are not perfectly known, things are not perfect because we are all humans, but we try to be as objective and precise as we can. And the studies that scientists use, they're trying to be as specific as they can and precise as they can be when talking about particular ideas. Okay. Now, you've got to understand that the scientific method just wasn't developed overnight, right? It was developed, it was tried, and it was tested over years and years and years. And for the most part, this is what scientists found out to be the best thing, is this simple structure. At least they noticed that this is the structure they were using, okay? And they noticed, and part of they also had to be objective, and being objective, that meant that it was to challenge an idea. It was not to determine a scientist being correct, because the point is not to be correct all the time, because most tests are not correct all the time. Things get muddy. Things get a little confusing, and they need to be corrected, and they have to be altered. And if let's say they fail, is it really a failure when you know that if you say mix these two things, you do not get this thing? Is that really a failure? I don't think so, because now well, if you mix these two things, you don't get this thing, so don't mix them, So there are 6 steps in the scientific method. The first one, typically, you're going to observe. Second one, you form a question. Number 3, you form then a hypothesis. Then you test that hypothesis with experimentation. You analyze the results and try to make a conclusion if you can. And once that's all done, you repeat it, see if you get the same results. And if it's all good to go, you shoot it out to your friends, you give it to your colleagues for them to go over, for them to read it, for them to replicate it, and to see if what you did, they can do. Okay? And ideally, you want to go in this order, but in reality, it may not work out that nicely. You may have to go back and reform your hypothesis a couple times after testing it a couple times. Okay, it's basically just a simple, easy to follow step-by-step process that scientists have laid out to generally speak on the ways that they test an idea. Okay. So let's say that we're going to go through those steps. Let's say we're going to test something. What do we do? So we begin with those observations. So we go out to the world, or we're living in the world, and we are seeing things with our eyes. We're smelling things with our nose, and we use those observations, and we say, why does X do this? So we pose that question. We formulate that question. Okay. Now, after we've made those observations, after we've asked that question, we then need to make a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is a proposed answer to a question. Well, I can see in my observations that X is doing this. Why? Well, I'm going to give maybe an idea as to why it is. And when I do that, I write it in an if-then statement. So if X is happening, then this is why it's happening. Or when this is mixed with X, then this will happen. Okay. A better example, if I push the light switch in the upwards direction, then the lights will come on. Okay. An easy hypothesis that is testable. Okay, because they have to be testable. They have to be clear. They have to be concise. You have to be able to test them. Okay. So once we have the hypothesis, once we've made the question, once we have done our observation, next what we have to do is we have to formulate a test, and we have to see if our hypothesis is false or if our hypothesis is not false. So when creating an experiment, a scientist must control a number of things called variables. Now, this is hopefully a word you've heard before, but in case you haven't, or in case you forgot, variables are anything that can change or be changed in an experiment. Okay? And they're super important to control, because if we don't control most, if not all, variables, then our test may be a little off. Our test may be a little not so great. Okay? So in a test, we want to control certain variables to see what others change, or which others change, I should say. So we have different types of variables. So in a test, we have what's called a manipulated variable. This is a variable that changes the responding variable. Okay. And so you must ask, what's a responding variable? Well, a responding variable is a variable that changes in response to the manipulated variable. Okay. So these two are intertwined with one another. So you have the manipulated. This is the one that changes the responding. This is the one that the tester changes. Okay. You, if you are the tester, change the manipulated variable. It is the variable that you want to control, that you want to alter to see if it's going to make a difference on a different variable, okay, which would be the responding variable. How will it respond? So again, the responding variable is that variable that changes in response to the manipulated variable. Okay, it's the one that you want to see change. You're hoping for that variable to change, because if it does, you can say then, well, because it changed, then the manipulated variable has this influence on this responding variable, and you can add that to your conclusion. And then there's controls. So controls are variables that a scientist controls so that they have little to no impact in an experiment. Okay, it'd be something like temperatures or times, or time you leave something exposed somewhere. It is it is something you don't want. You're controlling variables that you don't want to alter your responding variable. Okay, because if you have controls that are interacting and changing your responding variable, then you can't say then that your manipulated variable is the one changing the responding variable. It's not a clear and precise test. So it's very important for scientists to understand what their manipulated variable is, what they hope responds as the responding variable, and then controlling pretty much everything else that they want to control. So let's see this as an example. So a baker wants to change their cake recipe in order to make the cakes fluffier, but doesn't know what to change. So the baker's going to test this out and decides that the first change the amount of butter, or the first thing to change is going to be the amount of butter added to the batter. So the baker makes sure the amount of flour, milks, egg, sugar, and baking powder are all the same, and that the temperature of the oven stays the same, and the time the cake bakes stays the same as it did before. So the baker then changes the amount of butter and then records their results. Okay. So real quick, let's see if you guys can do it before going to the next slide. Before we go to the next slide, which one's the manipulated variable and which one is the control variable? Or what's being controlled and what's responding? Okay, so take a second, maybe think about it. Okay, and maybe pause the video. Okay, so you pause the video. We're back here. We're going to go over to see what the manipulated variable is, what the responding variable is, and what the controls were in this experiment. So let's take a look here. So the thing that I catch right away is that fluffier. So the cake, or the baker wants a fluffier cake. Okay. And to me, that sounds like, okay, that's the end result. It wants the cake to be fluffier. That's going to be my responding variable, is the fluffiness of the cake. What is he going to change? What is he going to do to change that? What is he manipulating? Well, he's manipulating the amount of butter. So I have my responding variable, the fluffiness of the cake, versus the manipulated variable, the amount of butter he's going to add to the cake. So then what is he controlling? Well, we can see here that the baker's going to make sure that the amount of flour, milk, egg, sugar, baking powder are all the same, and that the temperature of the oven stays the same, and that the time stays the same. Okay? Those are the controls. That's what he doesn't want that to affect the fluffiness of the cake, or at least he doesn't know if those will change anything. He wants to try that butter first. Okay? And he doesn't want those to affect, the changes from the amount of butter. Okay? So sorry about that bell. So again, let's go through that. So the manipulated variable in this example is the amount of butter. Responding variable is the fluffiness of the cake. And this baker is controlling for the same, he's controlling the experiment by keeping the same amount of other ingredients, making sure that the temperature of the oven is the same, at the time the cake bakes in the oven is always the same. Okay? And that's even, and obviously the test doesn't stop there, because he would have to go through each ingredient. And if it's not an ingredient, maybe it's the heat, maybe it's the time it sits in the oven, maybe it's even the way that he mixes the batter together. Okay, but the idea is that the even a baker in this example is using the scientific method in trying to figure out how it is that they can change the fluffiness of their cake. Okay. So getting back to that overgeneralized and over summarized, I guess, process of the scientific method. So we've formed a hypothesis, we asked the question, we got our observations, we've tested it. So now we're done testing. Okay. So after testing, we're now going to analyze our results and then provide a conclusion as to why we think that the hypothesis is false or that it's not false. Okay. So after that, then after that, you're going to repeat it a bunch of 100 times. This is that repeat stage, making sure that the test you just did is perfect, or at least it's close to it. That if anyone else in the world we're going to measure was going to do this test, they would get the same results as you. And if it holds up, then you share it with a colleague, you share it with a friend of yours. You have them read it, you have them run the test. And if they get the same results, then you can say then that your test has been peer reviewed, and it'll be published in a journal or an archive for other people to use, for other people to see, and to utilize, and while they also expand science. And that's pretty much, for the most part, generally speaking, how the scientific method is used. Okay. So then where does it go? Where, after you have, let's say you have proven that your hypothesis is not false, that it seems like it holds up pretty well, where do you go from there? So where you go from there is then you can then use that to bolster a scientific theory, or you can say that I just discovered something that's crazy important and something that is crazy. It was important. It was never observed ever anywhere before, and we see it all the time. And then you can say then that it can be stated as a scientific law. So what are the differences between the two? Well, scientific theory is a well-tested explanation for a set or number of experimental results. Okay, so a theory more or less just tells, give or take, it's saying why something happens. So cell theory, cell theory is the idea that all living organisms have cells. Part of the reason why it's a theory is because maybe there's life somewhere out there that is not made up of cells. But it tells us that, well, we have organisms. Why do we call them organisms? Well, it's because we rely on the cell theory, because we say then, because they're organisms, or because we categorize them as organisms, they have cells. Okay. Scientific law, however, scientific law is a statement that summarizes a pattern found in nature. So it's not telling us why something's happening, it's telling us how something's happening. So a good example of that is universal law of gravitation. Okay, so and this is one of Newton's laws, and Newton was just like, look at this. Like when you do this, when you put masses at a certain distance from one another, they're attracted to one another, and we can measure how that attraction, or we can measure that attraction, the rate of that attraction. And he then formulated the universal law of gravitation. It doesn't say why those things gravitate towards one another. It doesn't tell us why it is that these variables, like like mass, like size, makes them do that. It's just something we observe, and that is found everywhere in nature. Okay? So it's a little difficult to get off, right off the bat. But again, theory tells us why. It tells us what it is. It's telling us it's a description. It's a way that we theorize or say that, well, again, as in cell theory, all living organisms are composed of cells. Again, we know they're living. Well, why do we know they're living? Well, because they're composed of cells. And we should expect that most other living things that we come in contact with also will have cells. Whereas in scientific law, well, it's just a thing that's happening. We don't know why it's happening. We can measure that it's happening. We can get measurements from it. But it's difficult almost impossible to say why it's happening. So those are the biggest differences between them. But the bigger thing to understand, a hypothesis does not become a theory, and a theory does not become a law. There's no stair step, from hypothesis to scientific law, because all three of them are completely different. Okay, a theory uses multiple different hypotheses in order to explain why something's doing what it does. A law will even use different theories, and will use different hypotheses to say, like, well, we observed this thing, we're going to use these other hypotheses to then show our measurements. Okay, but a hypothesis does not move up to a theory when it's proved enough, and then when the theory's proved even more, it does not become a law. Okay, they're completely different things. Okay, so remember, a theory tells us why, a law tells us how. Okay, again, theory tells us why, law tells us how. So always remember that. It's something super important, because again, there's no stair step. One isn't promoted to the next. Okay, and then lastly, part of all the scientific method and the scientific process, one of the most important things to remember is that when you're building things and when you are trying to accurately represent things, after you have shown that, hey, look, I've got the data, this thing pretty much exists, we're going to make something out of it. We're going to model something out of it. And models are used in a variety of different categories, in different experiments. They're used after experiments to show something happening because they are representation of an object or event. Okay? And it helps us better understand what's going on. Models help us to understand why it is that something is reacting the way that it's reacting. Okay, why something is interacting with something else? Why is it that it's shaped the way it's shaped? And taking bigger objects, making them smaller so that we can see them, or taking smaller objects and making them bigger so we can get a better sense of what's happening. Okay. So as an example, I pretty much just said it. It's like building a sculpture to scale, creating a mathematical equation to predict something in the future. Okay, so models, super important. All right, so that's the wrap up on these notes. If you found these helpful, awesome. If you have any questions, let me know. And as I'm saying this, I'm going to X out of here because I got to go all the way to the top. So again, if you have any questions, let me know. Email me, send me a note on Remind, book an appointment with me, whatever it is, get a hold of me, and then we'll go from there. All right. Thank you guys. Have a good one.